You ever have one of those moments where your whole life changes because somebody else made a bad assumption? Not a crime, not a mistake you made, just someone looking at you and deciding you don't belong where you're standing. Yeah, that happened to Daniel Mercer on a quiet Saturday afternoon in a neighborhood where nothing ever happens, until it did. And the wild part is, Daniel wasn't doing anything unusual at all. He was washing his car. That's it. Hose in one hand, sponge in the other, sunlight bouncing off the black paint of a 1970 Dodge Charger he'd spent years rebuilding piece by piece. The kind of slow, peaceful weekend moment people dream about after decades of working hard. Daniel was 52 years old, retired Army, broad shoulders, calm eyes, the kind of man who had already seen more chaos in life than most people ever will. 28 years in uniform will do that to you. Combat deployments, medals, injuries that never quite heal, right? Friends who didn't make it home. All that stuff leaves a mark. But it also teaches you something important about control, about patience. When you've survived real danger, you stop panicking about small things. You know what I mean? Which is probably why Daniel didn't even flinch when the yelling started. Step away from the vehicle now. The voice came from the edge of his driveway, sharp and loud, like somebody trying to sound bigger than they actually felt. Daniel turned slowly, water dripping off the sponge in his hand, and saw a police cruiser angled halfway into his driveway, like it owned the place. A young officer stepped out, hand hovering near his holster, jaw tight, like he'd already decided this was going to be a confrontation. His name was Trevor Baines, 26, fresh out of the academy a few years earlier, still carrying that energy some rookies have where everything feels like a threat if it doesn't match the script in their head. "Hands where I can see them," Baines shouted. Daniel blinked once, set the sponge gently on the bucket, and lifted his empty palms just a little, not surrendering, just showing there was nothing there. "You talking to me?" Officer Baines stepped closer. "You match the description of a suspect involved in auto theft." Daniel looked down at the Charger, then back at the officer. The corners of his mouth moved just slightly. "Well, that's impressive," he said calmly. "Stealing my own car while washing it in my own driveway. Now right there, that should have been the moment the whole situation ended. The officer could have laughed, maybe apologized, maybe even complimented the car. Happens all the time when things get mixed up. But instead, something in Trevor Baines tightened up. You could see it in his posture. Pride mixed with embarrassment, a dangerous combination in a person holding authority. "Don't get smart with me," Baines snapped. "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands on your head." Daniel straightened just a little, feet planted comfortably on the driveway he'd paid for with decades of work. "Officer," he said quietly, "I'm standing on my own property. My hands are empty. I'm not a threat. So before this turns into something bigger than it needs to be, maybe you explain exactly what you think I'm doing wrong." That sentence landed like a rock in a pond. Baines didn't like it. He wasn't used to people speaking calmly while questioning his authority. Most people either panic or argue. Daniel did neither. He just stood there like a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. And sometimes that confidence makes insecure people nervous. "I said, hands on your head," Baines barked again. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Still waiting for the legal reason," he said. Across the street, a neighbor named Mrs. Evelyn Brooks had stepped out onto her porch with a glass of iced tea. She'd lived on that block for 15 years. She knew Daniel, knew he helped shovel snow for older folks in winter, knew he'd spent years restoring that Charger. The moment she saw the officer pointing and yelling, she pulled out her phone and started recording. "Officer," she called across the street. "That man lives there." Baines didn't even look in her direction. "Ma'am, please go back inside." Daniel gave a small breath through his nose, almost like a laugh he decided not to finish. "That strategy usually work for you?" he asked. Ignoring information until it disappears, Baines pointed a finger at him. "You are dangerously close to obstruction." Daniel nodded once. "And you're dangerously close to a lawsuit." Now things shifted, because at that moment it stopped being about suspicion and started being about ego. Baines had driven past earlier, saw a large black man with a classic muscle car in a neighborhood that didn't match the picture in his mind, and decided something must be wrong. That assumption had already happened. The only question now was whether he had the humility to admit it. Turns out he didn't. So he started fishing. "Let me see some ID," Baines demanded. Daniel tilted his head. "Am I being detained?" "Yes." "On what grounds?" Baines hesitated just long enough to show he hadn't thought that part through. "Suspicious activity in the area." Daniel nodded slowly. That's vague. You match the description. What description? Baines cleared his throat. Blackmail, large build, tampering with vehicles. Daniel looked around at the bucket of soapy water and sponge. Does that look like tampering to you? Another neighbor had stepped outside by now. Then another. Phones started appearing. Nobody said much. They just watched. And you could see the pressure building in Baines's shoulders. He keyed his radio and called in the VIN number from the Charger's windshield. Everyone waited. Even the street got quiet. Dispatch crackled back through the speaker. Vehicle registered to Daniel Mercer. Address matches current location. That should have ended it. Clean, simple, no crime. But Baines stared at Daniel like the confirmation had somehow insulted him personally. That doesn't prove you're Daniel Mercer, he said. Mrs. Brooks actually laughed out loud. Daniel raised his eyebrows. So, what exactly do you want here? He asked. A baby photo. Maybe I call my mother. Baines's ears were turning red now. Cameras were pointed at him from 3 different angles. Admitting he was wrong in front of all those witnesses would have bruised his pride. And some people would rather destroy everything around them than feel that bruise. Turn around, Baines said, suddenly pulling out handcuffs. Hands behind your back. Daniel didn't move. For what crime? Obstruction. Non-compliance. Daniel stared at him. You can't arrest me for resisting an arrest that hasn't happened yet. Baines stepped forward. Turn around. There was a long pause right there, the kind where you could almost hear people thinking. Daniel's expression changed slightly. Not fear, calculation. He'd spent years around armed men under stress. He knew how quickly bad decisions could turn fatal, so he made a choice. Slowly, deliberately, he turned around. For the record, he said loudly enough for every phone camera to hear, I am complying. I am not resisting. The cuffs snapped shut too tight. Daniel winced. Old nerve damage lit up his wrists. Too tight, he said. Check the spacing. Be quiet, Baines snapped, pushing him against the side of the Charger. The same car Daniel had spent 7 years restoring. His cheek touched the cool paint. Somewhere behind him, Mrs. Brooks shouted, This is ridiculous! The walk to the cruiser felt longer than it was. Daniel passed the front steps of his house, the flower pots his late wife had planted years earlier, the small American flag hanging beside the door. That part hurt more than the cuffs. He had served under that flag, and now he was being marched past it like a criminal in his own driveway. In the back seat, Daniel closed his eyes and started breathing the way he'd learned during combat deployments. Slow, controlled, steady. Not panic, strategy. Inventory the moment. Witnesses, cameras, words spoken. Everything mattered now. Up front, Baines had gone quiet. Funny how the loudest people get silent once the adrenaline fades. Halfway to the station, Daniel spoke softly. You nervous? No answer. You should be. At the station, the truth unraveled quickly. Desk Sergeant Lewis Bennett looked at Daniel, then looked at the arrest report, then looked at Officer Baines like he had just stepped in something unpleasant. What exactly happened here, he asked. Baines repeated the story. Obstruction, suspicious activity, refusing to identify himself. Bennett sighed. Give me the wallet. Inside was Daniel's driver's license, his address matching the house he'd been arrested at. Then a retired military ID, then a service commendation card. Bennett's eyebrows climbed slowly upward. You brought in a retired command sergeant major, he asked quietly. Baines said nothing. Daniel rubbed the red marks on his wrists. Sergeant, he said calmly, I'm not asking for special treatment because of my service. I'm asking for the same treatment any citizen deserves. 10 minutes later, the precinct captain arrived offering apologies and suggesting the whole situation could be quietly resolved. Daniel shook his head. You can't quietly erase what already happened, he said. Your officer pointed a weapon at me and dragged me off my property because of what he assumed I was. He asked for his phone, called an attorney before he even left the building. By Monday morning, the neighbor's video was everywhere online. Millions of people watched the footage of Daniel standing calm in his driveway while the officer escalated after being proven wrong. The department placed Trevor Baines on leave, then suspended him, then terminated him when more complaints surfaced. The city offered Daniel a settlement. He refused the first one. Too quiet, too convenient. The second offer included a public apology and formal findings of civil rights violations. That one he accepted, and donated most of the money to legal aid groups and veteran organizations. Months later, Daniel was back in the driveway washing the Charger again. Same bucket, same sunshine. A patrol car rolled down the street and his hands tightened for a moment before he could stop it. Trauma doesn't disappear just because justice shows up later. The cruiser slowed beside him. A female officer leaned out the window. "Beautiful car," she said with a smile. Daniel nodded. "Thank you." She drove on, and Daniel stood there a moment longer than usual, watching the car disappear around the corner. Because even when the story ends well on paper, something inside you remembers how it felt. So here's the question I want to ask you. Daniel Mercer did everything people say you're supposed to do. Stayed calm, cooperated when it mattered, trusted the system to eventually correct itself. But should anyone have to go through that just to prove they belong in their own driveway? What would you have done in his place? And be honest, have you ever seen someone judged first and questioned later, just because of how they looked or where they were standing? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this don't just ask what happened, they ask what kind of society we're willing to accept.